Chapter 3. Frona waved her hand to Andy and swung out on the trail. Fastened tightly to her back were her camera and a small traveling satchel. In addition, she carried for alpenstock the willow pole of Neeposa. Her dress was of the mountaineering sort, short-skirted and scant, allowing the greatest play with the least material, and withal gray of color and modest. Her outfit, on the backs of a dozen Indians and in charge of Del Bishop, had got under way hours before. The previous day, on her return with Matt McCarthy from the Siwash camp, she had found Del Bishop at the store waiting her. His business was quickly transacted, for the proposition he made was terse and to the point. She was going into the country. He was intending to go in. She would need somebody. If she had not picked anyone yet, why, he was just the man. He had forgotten to tell her the day he took her ashore that he had been in the country years before and knew all about it. True, he hated the water, and it was mainly a water journey, but he was not afraid of it. He was afraid of nothing. Further, he would fight for her at the drop of the hat. As for pay, when they got to Dawson, a good word from her to Jacob Wells, and a year's outfit would be his. No grub stake about it, no strings on him. He would pay for the outfit later on when his sack was dusted. What did she think about it, anyway? And Frona did think about it, for ere she had finished breakfast he was out hustling the packers together. She found herself making better speed than the majority of her fellows, who were heavily laden and had to rest their packs every few hundred yards. Yet she found herself hard put to keep the pace of a bunch of Scandinavians ahead of her. They were huge, strapping, blond-haired giants, each striding along with 100 pounds on his back, and all harnessed to a go-cart, which carried fully 600 more. Their faces were as laughing suns, and the joy of life was in them. The toil seemed child's play and slipped from them lightly. They joked with one another and with the passers-by in a meaningless tongue, and their great chests rumbled with cavern-echoing laughs. Men stood aside for them and looked after them enviously, for they took the rises of the trail on the run, and rattled down the counterslopes, and ground the iron-rimmed wheels harshly over the rocks. Plunging through a dark stretch of woods, they came out upon the river at the ford. A drowned man lay on his back on the sandbar, staring upward, unblinking, at the sun. A man, in irritated tones, was questioning over and over, "Where's his pardner? Ain't he got a pardner?" Two more men had thrown off their packs and were coolly taking an inventory of the dead man's possessions. One called aloud the various articles, while the other checked them off on a piece of dirty wrapping paper. Letters and receipts, wet and pulpy, strewed the sand. A few gold coins were heaped carelessly on a white handkerchief. Other men, crossing back and forth in canoes and skiffs, took no notice. The Scandinavians glanced at the sight, and their faces sobered for a moment. "Where's his partner? Ain't he got a partner?" the irritated man demanded of them. They shook their heads. They did not understand English. They stepped into the water and splashed onward. Some one called warningly from the opposite bank, whereat they stood still and conferred together. Then they started on again. The two men taking the inventory turned to watch. The current rose nigh to their hips, but it was swift and they staggered, while now and again the cart slipped sideways with the stream. The worst was over, and Frona found herself holding her breath. The water had sunk to the knees of the two foremost men when a strap snapped on one nearest the cart. His pack swung suddenly to the side, overbalancing him. At the same instant the man next to him slipped, and each jerked the other under. The next two were whipped off their feet, while the cart, turning over, swept from the bottom of the ford into the deep water. Two men who had almost emerged threw themselves backward on the pull ropes. The effort was heroic, but giants though they were, the task was too great, and they were dragged, inch by inch, downward and under. Their packs held them to the bottom, save him whose strap had broken. This one struck out, not to the shore, but down the stream, striving to keep up with his comrades. A couple of 100 feet below, the rapid dashed over a toothed reef of rocks, and here, a minute later, they appeared. The cart, still loaded, showed first, smashing a wheel and turning over and over into the next plunge. The men followed in a miserable tangle. They were beaten against the submerged rocks and swept on, all but one. Frona, in a canoe (a dozen canoes were already in pursuit), saw him grip the rock with bleeding fingers. She saw his white face and the agony of the effort, but his hold relaxed and he was jerked away, just as his free comrade, swimming mightily, was reaching for him. Hidden from sight, they took the next plunge, showing for a second, still struggling, at the shallow foot of the rapid. A canoe picked up the swimming man, but the rest disappeared in a long stretch of swift, deep water. For a quarter of an hour the canoes plied fruitlessly about, then found the dead men gently grounded in an eddy. A tow rope was requisitioned from an upcoming boat, and a pair of horses from a pack train on the bank, and the ghastly jetsam hauled ashore. Frona looked at the 5 young giants lying in the mud, broken-boned, limp, uncaring. They were still harnessed to the cart, and the poor worthless packs still clung to their backs. The 6th sat in the midst, dry-eyed and stunned. A dozen feet away, the steady flood of life flowed by, and Frona melted into it and went on. The dark, spruce-shrouded mountains drew close together in the Dyea Canyon, and the feet of men churned the wet, sunless earth into mire and bog-hole. And when they had done this, they sought new paths, till there were many paths. And on such a path Frona came upon a man spread carelessly in the mud. He lay on his side, legs apart, and one arm buried beneath him, pinned down by a bulky pack. His cheek was pillowed restfully in the ooze, and on his face there was an expression of content. He brightened when he saw her, and his eyes twinkled cheerily. "'Bout time you hove along," he greeted her. "Been waitin' an hour on you as it is." "That's it," as Frona bent over him. "Just unbuckle that strap. The pesky thing, 'twas just out of my reach all the time." "Are you hurt?" she asked. He slipped out of his straps, shook himself, and felt the twisted arm. "Nope. Sound as $1, thank you. And no kick to register either." He reached over and wiped his muddy hands on a low-browed spruce. "Just my luck, but I got a good rest, so what's the good of making a beef about it? You see, I tripped on that little root there, and slip, slump, slam, and slush. There I was, down and out, and the buckle just out of reach. And there I lay for a blasted hour, everybody hitting the lower path." "But why didn't you call out to them?" "And make 'em climb up the hill to me? Them all tuckered out with their own work? Not on your life. Wasn't serious enough. If any other man'd make me climb up just because he'd slipped down, I'd take him out of the mud all right, and punch him back into the mud again. Besides, I knew somebody was bound to come along my way after a while." "Oh, you'll do," she cried, appropriating Del Bishop's phrase. "You'll do for this country." "Yep," he called back, shouldering his pack and starting off at a lively clip. "And anyway, I got a good rest." The trail dipped through a precipitous morass in the river's brink. A slender pine tree spanned the screaming foam and bent midway to touch the water. The surge beat upon the taper trunk and gave it a rhythmical swaying motion, while the feet of the packers had worn smooth its wave-washed surface. 80 feet it stretched in ticklish insecurity. Frona stepped upon it, felt it move beneath her, heard the bellowing of the water, saw the mad rush, and shrank back. She slipped the knot of her shoelaces and pretended great care in the tying thereof as a bunch of Indians came out of the woods above and down through the mud. 3 or 4 bucks led the way, followed by many squaws, all bending in the head straps to the heavy packs. Behind came the children, burdened according to their years, and in the rear half a dozen dogs, tongues lagging out and dragging forward painfully under their several loads. The men glanced at her sideways, and one of them said something in an undertone. Frona could not hear, but the snicker which went down the line brought the flush of shame to her brow and told her more forcibly than could the words. Her face was hot, for she sat disgraced in her own sight, but she gave no sign. The leader stood aside, and one by one, and never more than one at a time, they made the perilous passage. At the bend in the middle their weight forced the tree under, and they felt for their footing up to the ankles in the cold driving current. Even the little children made it without hesitancy, and then the dogs, whining and reluctant but urged on by the man. When the last had crossed over, he turned to Frona. Horse trail," he said, pointing up the mountainside. "Much better you take horse trail. More far. Much better." But she shook her head and waited till he reached the farther bank. She felt the call, not only upon her own pride, but upon the pride of her race, and it was a greater demand than her demand, such as the race was greater than she. So she put foot upon the log, and with the eyes of the alien people upon her, walked down into the foam-white swirl. She came upon a man weeping by the side of the trail. His pack, clumsily strapped, sprawled on the ground. He had taken off a shoe, and one naked foot showed swollen and blistered. "What's the matter?" she asked, halting before him. He looked up at her, then down into the depths where the Dyea River cut the gloomy darkness with its living silver. The tears still welled in his eyes, and he sniffled. "What is the matter?" she repeated. "Can I be of any help?" "No," he replied. "How can you help? My feet are raw and my back is nearly broken, and I am all tired out. Can you help any of these things?" "Well," judiciously, "I am sure it might be worse. Think of the men who have just landed on the beach. It will take them 10 days or 2 weeks to back-trip their outfits as far as you have already got yours." "But my partners have left me and gone on," he moaned, a sneaking appeal for pity in his voice. "And I am all alone, and I don't feel able to move another step. And then think of my wife and the babies. I left them down in the States. Oh, if they could only see me now! I can't go back to them, and I can't go on. It's too much for me. I can't stand it, this working like a horse. I was not made for work like a horse. I'll die. I know I will if I do. Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" "Why did your comrades leave you?" "Because I was not so strong as they. Because I could not pack as much or as long, and they laughed at me and left me." "Have you ever roughed it?" Frona asked. "No." "You look well put up and strong. Weigh probably 165?" 170, he corrected. "You don't look as though you had ever been troubled with sickness. Never an invalid?" "No." "And your comrades? They are miners?" "Never mining in their lives. They worked in the same establishment with me. That's what makes it so hard, don't you see? We'd known one another for years, and to go off and leave me just because I couldn't keep up." "My friend," and Frona knew she was speaking for the race, "you are strong as they. You can work just as hard as they, pack as much, but you are weak of heart. This is no place for the weak of heart. You cannot work like a horse because you will not. Therefore the country has no use for you. The North wants strong men, strong of soul, not body. The body does not count. So go back to the States. We do not want you here. If you come, you will die. And what then of your wife and babies? So sell your outfit and go back. You will be home in 3 weeks. Goodbye." She passed through Sheep Camp. Somewhere above, a mighty glacier, under the pent pressure of a subterranean reservoir, had burst asunder and hurled 100,000 tons of ice and water down the rocky gorge. The trail was yet slippery with the slime of the flood, and men were rummaging disconsolately in the rubbish of overthrown tents and caches. But here and there they worked with nervous haste, and the stark corpses by the trailside attested dumbly to their labor. A few hundred yards beyond, the work of the rush went on uninterrupted. Men rested their packs on jutting stones, swapped escapes whilst they regained their breath, then stumbled on to their toil again. The midday sun beat down upon the stone scales. The forest had given up the struggle, and the dizzying heat recoiled from the unclothed rock. On either side rose the ice-marred ribs of earth, naked and strenuous under their nakedness. Above towered storm-beaten Chilcoot. Up its gaunt and ragged front crawled a slender string of men. But it was an endless string. It came out of the last fringe of dwarfed shrub below, drew a black line across a dazzling stretch of ice, and filed past Frona where she ate her lunch by the way. And it went on, up the pitch of the steep, growing fainter and smaller, till it squirmed and twisted like a column of ants and vanished over the crest of the pass. Even as she looked, Chilcoot was wrapped in a rolling mist and whirling cloud, and a storm of sleet and wind roared down upon the toiling pygmies. The light was swept out of the day, and deep gloom prevailed. But Frona knew that somewhere up there, clinging and climbing and immortally striving, the long line of ants still twisted towards the sky. And she thrilled at the thought, strong with man's ancient love of mastery, and stepped into the line which came out of the storm behind and disappeared into the storm before. She blew through the gap of the pass in a whirlwind of vapor, with hand and foot clambered down the volcanic ruin of Chilcoot's mighty father, and stood on the bleak edge of the lake which filled the pit of the crater. The lake was angry and white-capped, and though 100 caches were waiting ferriage, no boats were plying back and forth. A rickety skeleton of sticks and a shell of greased canvas lay upon the rocks. Frona sought out the owner, a bright-faced young fellow with sharp black eyes and salient jaw. Yes, he was the ferryman, but he had quit work for the day. Water too rough for freighting. He charged $25 for passengers, but he was not taking passengers today. Had he not said it was too rough? That was why. "But you will take me, surely?" she asked. He shook his head and gazed out over the lake. "At the far end it's rougher than you see it here. Even the big wooden boats won't tackle it. The last that tried, with a gang of packers aboard, was blown over on the west shore. We could see them plainly. And as there's no trail around from there, they'll have to camp it out till the blow is over." "But they're better off than I am. My camp outfit is at Happy Camp, and I can't very well stay here." Frona smiled winsomely, but there was no appeal in the smile, no feminine helplessness throwing itself on the strength and chivalry of the male. "Do reconsider and take me across." "No." "I'll give you 50. "No, I say." "But I'm not afraid, you know." The young fellow's eyes flashed angrily. He turned upon her suddenly, but on second thought did not utter the words forming on his lips. She realized the unintentional slur she had cast and was about to explain. But on second thought she, too, remained silent. For she read him, and knew that it was perhaps the only way for her to gain her point. They stood there, bodies inclined to the storm in the manner of seamen on sloped decks, unyieldingly looking into each other's eyes. His hair was plastered in wet ringlets on his forehead, and hers in longer wisps beat furiously about her face. "Come on, then." He flung the boat into the water with an angry jerk and tossed the oars aboard. "Climb in. I'll take you, but not for your $50. You pay the regulation price, and that's all." A gust of the gale caught the light shell and swept it broadside for a score of feet. The spray drove inboard in a continuous stinging shower, and Frona at once fell to work with the bailing can. "I hope we're not blown ashore," he shouted, stooping forward to the oars. "It would be embarrassing for you." He looked up savagely into her face. "No," she modified, "but it would be very miserable for both of us. A night without tent, blankets, or fire. Besides, we're not going to blow ashore." She stepped out on the slippery rocks and helped him heave up the canvas craft and tilt the water out. On either side uprose bare, wet walls of rock. A heavy sleet was falling steadily, through which a few streaming caches showed in the gathering darkness. "You'd better hurry up," he advised, thanking her for the assistance and relaunching the boat. 2 miles of stiff trail from here to Happy Camp. No wood till you get there, so you'd best hustle along. Good-bye." Frona reached out and took his hand and said, "You are a brave man." "Oh, I don't know." He returned the grip with usury and looked his admiration. A dozen tents held grimly to their pegs on the extreme edge of the timber line at Happy Camp. Frona, weary with the day, went from tent to tent. Her wet skirts clung heavily to her tired limbs while the wind buffeted her brutally about. Once, through a canvas wall, she heard a man apostrophizing gorgeously and felt sure that it was Del Bishop. But a peep into the interior told a different tale. So she wandered fruitlessly on till she reached the last tent in the camp. She untied the flap and looked in. A spluttering candle showed the one occupant, a man, down on his knees and blowing lustily into the firebox of a smoky Yukon stove. End of Chapter 3, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com.